Spartacus was born around 111 BCE in the rugged lands of Thrace, a region lying between the Balkans and the Black Sea, inhabited by fierce tribes who were both warriors and horsemen. Unlike the legend of emperors or kings, the beginnings of Spartacus were humble, uncertain, and shrouded in the mist of ancient rumor. Some Roman chroniclers claim he was born free, perhaps even of noble Thracian stock, while others insist he was captured as a young man and sold into bondage. In the Thracian highlands, boys were taught early the ways of war. They learned to ride, to wield the short sword, and honor the gods of earth and storm. Spartacus would have grown in this world of survival and defiance. His spirit hardened by the harsh winters and the constant wars between tribes and foreign powers. Thracians had long served as mercenaries for Rome. Fierce soldiers admired for their bravery, but mistrusted for their temper. It was likely during one of Rome's campaigns in the Balkans that Spartacus' fate took a cruel turn. Captured, perhaps in rebellion against Roman authority or as a deserter from Rome's auxiliary forces, he was enslaved, chained, and sent south across the Adriatic to Italy. His name, Spartacus, is itself Romanized. His true Thracian name is lost to time. Enslavement in Rome was a life of degradation. The Republic's wealth and glory were built on the backs of the conquered, men, women, and children from Gaul, Africa, Greece, and the East, forced into labor, entertainment, or servitude. Spartacus was sold not as a domestic slave or a field laborer, but to a ludus, a gladiatorial training school in Capua, owned by a man named Lentulus Batiatus. Here, surrounded by the clang of weapons and the roar of the arena, Spartacus was trained to fight for Roman amusement. He learned to kill not for his people, but for applause. Yet beneath the brutal discipline, his spirit remained unbroken. Ancient historians describe him as intelligent, dignified, and cunning. Not a mere brute of sands, but a man of thought and will. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic uprisings in the ancient world, a rebellion that would shake the foundations of the Roman Republic itself. The gladiatorial school of Batiatus was a grim factory of death. Men from every corner of Rome's empire were confined within its stone walls: Gauls, Germans, Africans, Greeks, each stripped of identity, given a weapon, and turned into an instrument of bloodshed. Spartacus was among them, trained as a myrmillo, a heavy-armed fighter with helmet, shield, and gladius. The life of a gladiator was paradoxical. Despised as a slave, yet adored by the masses. When he fought well, the crowd roared his name. When he fell, he died a spectacle. Survival required skill, instinct, and luck. Those who resisted the system were beaten, starved, or crucified as examples. Yet within this prison of sport, Spartacus began to see that even the strongest could be broken unless they fought for something more than life. He formed bonds with other fighters, among them Crassus, a towering Gaul, Enemaus, a disciplined African, and Castus and Gannicus, whose names would become legend. Together they spoke in whispers of freedom, of home, of vengeance. The dream was madness. A handful of slaves against the might of Rome. But for men who had nothing left to lose, madness was the only hope. According to Plutarch, the spark was lit in 73 BCE. A plot was hatched within the school. About 200 gladiators planned to rise, seize the weapons, and escape. But the plan was betrayed. The guards struck first, but Spartacus and 70 others fought their way out, armed only with kitchen knives and skewers. They fled to the streets of Capua, killing their pursuers and seizing wagons of real weapons on the way. They made for the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, a rugged volcanic fortress south of Naples. There, among the rocks and forests, the fugitives prepared for war. From slaves, they became soldiers. From victims, avengers. For the first time in years, Spartacus looked not into the eyes of his masters, but into the horizon of his own destiny. The fugitives reached the heights of Mount Vesuvius and took shelter among its natural caves and cliffs. There, Spartacus' leadership began to emerge not through force, but through wisdom. He imposed discipline, organized supplies, and planned defenses. His followers, now numbering close to 100, saw in him not just a warrior, but a commander. Rome, however, saw only a band of runaway slaves. The Senate dispatched a small militia under Praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber to surround and starve them into submission. Glaber's men blocked the only known path down the mountain, believing victory was certain. Yet Spartacus proved to be more than a fugitive. He was a strategist. Using vines from the mountainside, Spartacus ordered his men to weave ropes and ladders. In the dead of night, they descended a steep, unguarded cliff, circled behind a Roman camp, and attacked. The Romans, caught off guard, were slaughtered. The slaves seized their weapons and armor, transforming from a ragged band into a disciplined army. Word of the victory spread like wildfire across Italy. From farms, mines, and households, slaves began to escape and flock to Spartacus' banner. Within weeks, his numbers swelled to thousands. Rome's contempt turned to alarm. What began as a rebellion was becoming a war. From the heights of Vesuvius, Spartacus looked down upon the fertile plains of Campania, lands owned by the same masters who once owned him. The fires of revolt burned bright. For the first time in Roman history, the Republic would face not a foreign enemy, but an army born from its own cruelty. The year was 73 BC. What had begun as a desperate flight of slaves was now an inferno sweeping through southern Italy. After their stunning victory on Mount Vesuvius, Spartacus and his comrades, Crassus, Enemaus, Castus, and Gannicus, descended into plains of Campania. There, they struck at estates, towns, and outposts, freeing slaves and cutting down all who stood in their way. The revolt spread like contagion. Enslaved men and women from every background, Greeks, Gauls, Thracians, Syrians, and Italians, joined the swelling army. Rome's countryside, once a symbol of its prosperity, became a war zone. Villas burned, crops were seized, and the chains of thousands were shattered. For the first time in generations, slaves called one another brother and sister instead of servant. Ancient chroniclers differ on Spartacus' intentions. Some claimed he sought to march north, escape Italy, and return home to Thrace. Others believed he dreamed of something greater, not just freedom for a few, but the destruction of slavery itself. Whatever his aim, his discipline and strategy set him apart from mere brigands. He forbade unnecessary cruelty, ensured fair distribution of spoils, and punished disorder among his ranks. The rebels were not a mob. They were an army, united by desperation and a single word: freedom. Rome, still underestimating the threat, sent another praetor, Publius Varinius, to crush the revolt. Varinius divided his forces into smaller detachments, intending to trap Spartacus from multiple directions. It was a grave mistake. Spartacus ambushed each unit separately, destroying them in rapid succession. Varinius himself barely escaped capture, losing his camp insignia and even his horse. The victories emboldened the rebels. From fewer than 100, their number grew to nearly 40,000. Among them were not only slaves, but also free peasants, deserters, and adventurers drawn by Spartacus' fame. He trained them relentlessly, teaching them Roman battle tactics, formations, and discipline. Their weapons, once scavenged, were now forged from captured Roman forges. But with victory came temptation. As the army grew, so did its divisions. Crassus and the Gauls, eager for plunder, began to push for open war against the cities. Spartacus, cautious and strategic, urged restraint. His goal was survival and escape, not senseless slaughter. Yet unity among so many desperate men was fragile. The rebellion's strength would soon become its greatest weakness. In early 72 BCE, Spartacus led his army northward through Italy, seeking passage over the Alps. Freedom lay beyond, the chance for each man to return to his homeland. Rome was in chaos. The Senate, humiliated by repeated defeats, scrambled to assemble new legions. For the moment, the road was open. The march was immense. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children moving through the Italian countryside, accompanied by wagons of supplies and herds of stolen livestock. It was not an army of conquest, but of survival. Yet, wherever they passed, the symbols of Roman oppression fell. City after city trembled. Some opened their gates and surrendered. Others resisted and were annihilated. At Picenum and Lucania, Spartacus crushed Roman detachments that dared confront him. His tactics were fluid: ambush, deception, and mobility. The Romans, trained for set-piece battles, found themselves humiliated by a man they had once chained. But as they neared the Alps, dissent erupted once more. Crassus and his Gaulish followers refused to leave Italy. They wanted vengeance, not escape. Against Spartacus' orders, They broke away to fight their own war. The decision proved fatal. Roman legions under Lucius Gellius Publicola cornered and annihilated the Gauls. Crassus, Spartacus' trusted comrade and friend, was slain. When news of his death reached Spartacus, he was consumed by rage. He gathered his army and met the Romans in battle near Mount Garganus. The result was devastating. Spartacus' forces crushed both consular armies, killing thousands. In honor of Crassus, he held funeral games in the old style, forcing captured Roman soldiers to fight to the death as gladiators once had. The circle of fate had come full. The enslaved now ruled the arena. Yet Spartacus knew vengeance could not win the war. Though victorious, he faced a grim truth. His men were not ready to face the might of Rome indefinitely. The Alps were still open, but many refused to leave, intoxicated by victory. Spartacus, torn between reason and loyalty, turned his army back south. The dream of freedom across the mountains slipped away, and with it, the rebellion's best chance of survival. The Senate could no longer dismiss the slave rebellion as a local disturbance. 2 praetors and 2 consuls had failed. Italy was aflame, and Rome's pride was bleeding. The revolt was no longer just a threat to property. It was a threat to the very idea of Roman supremacy. In desperation, the Senate turned to a man of wealth, power, and ruthless ambition, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus, one of Rome's richest men, accepted the command of 6 legions, over 40,000 soldiers. Unlike his predecessors, he understood the gravity of the situation. He reimposed strict military discipline, even executing 1 in 10 men decimation among units that had fled from Spartacus. Fear, he knew, could be as powerful as loyalty. By the time Crassus took command, Spartacus had moved south once again. His plan, according to sources, was to reach Sicily. There, he hoped to cross the strait with the help of Cilician pirates, who promised to ferry his army and reignite rebellion on the island. Sicily, once the site of previous slave wars, seemed the perfect refuge. But betrayal struck. The pirates took Spartacus' payment and vanished. The army was stranded in southern Italy. Crassus seized the moment. He built massive fortifications across the Isthmus of Rhegium, trapping Spartacus in the peninsula. Cut off from supplies and escape, the rebels faced starvation. Yet Spartacus refused to surrender. In a daring night assault, he broke through Crassus' lines, escaping the trap and once again proving his genius as a commander. The war dragged into its 3rd year. Both sides were exhausted, but Rome's patience was over. Crassus pursued relentlessly, determined to crush the rebellion before his rival, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus Pompey, returning from Spain, could steal his glory. As the legions closed in from north and south, Spartacus prepared for the final stand, a last battle that would decide not only his fate, but the legacy of every man who dared defy Rome. The year was 71 BC. For nearly 2 years, Spartacus had defied the greatest power in the ancient world. But now, surrounded by Roman armies under Marcus Crassus to the south and Pompey's legions returning from Hispania to the north, the rebellion's horizon was closing. The dream of freedom was dying beneath the weight of Rome's vengeance. After breaking through Crassus' fortifications in the south, Spartacus regrouped his weary army near the Bruttian Peninsula, the toe of Italy's boot. His numbers had dwindled. From once over 70,000, only about 40,000 remained. The rest had fallen in battle, deserted, or perished from hunger and disease. Still, those who stood beside him were the fiercest and most loyal, men and women hardened by fire and bound by blood. Spartacus attempted once more to cross into Sicily, hoping to reignite the slave revolts that had once ravaged the island decades before. But fate and Rome's iron will forbade it. Crassus' forces had tightened the blockade, cutting off all maritime routes. The rebels were trapped on the mainland. In desperation, Spartacus turned to battle. He began launching sudden attacks on Roman detachments, using guerrilla tactics to disrupt supplies and communications. His fighters moved swiftly through the hills, striking like wolves and vanishing into the forests. But Crassus, unlike previous Roman commanders, refused to be baited. He fortified every position, building trenches, walls, and camps to wear the slaves down through attrition. The once glorious army of Spartacus was now cornered and starving. The terrain that had once sheltered them became their prison. Many of the rebels began to lose faith. Internal divisions grew. Yet Spartacus remained unyielding. Plutarch records that he slaughtered his own horse before the final battle, declaring, "If I win, I shall have horses enough for my enemies. If I lose, I shall have no need of one." Spartacus' army, exhausted and outnumbered, stood before the legions of Crassus, 8 cohorts deep, with steel glinting in unbroken ranks. Behind them, the standards of Rome fluttered like a storm on the horizon. Spartacus arranged his men into a dense wedge formation. They had no cavalry, little armor, and dwindling supplies, yet their eyes were fierce. The man who had once been a slave, a gladiator, and a fugitive now stood as a general, his face marked by battle, his hands scarred by years of war. Before the clash began, ancient historians claim Spartacus addressed his troops. His words, though lost to time, are imagined by chroniclers as a final cry of defiance, not for conquest, but for dignity. He reminded them that they had won their freedom once already, and that even if they fell, they would die as men, not as slaves. Then came the charge. Like a thunderclap, Spartacus led the assault himself, cutting straight toward Crassus' command lines. The shock was immense. The slaves broke through the first Roman ranks, cutting down centurions and scattering cohorts. Spartacus fought like a man possessed, seeking out Crassus himself amid the chaos. But the numbers were overwhelming. Surrounded, his warriors fell one by one. According to Plutarch, Spartacus' horse was slain under him, yet he continued to fight on foot, wounded but unbroken. His bodyguards formed a circle around him, buying him moments that history would remember forever. He was last seen surrounded by corpses, Roman and slave alike, fighting until the very end. When the dust settled, tens of thousands lay dead on the field. Spartacus' body was never found. Some say he was buried beneath the fallen. Others believe the gods carried him away, sparing his corpse the humiliation of Roman display. The rebellion was crushed, but spirit, the dream of freedom, would echo through centuries. In the aftermath of Spartacus' death, the vengeance of Rome was merciless. Crassus, determined to stamp out every remnant of the rebellion, ordered the execution of 6,000 surviving captives. They were crucified along the Appian Way, the main road stretching from Capua to Rome. Over 200 kilometers of human suffering. The sight was meant to terrify, not to honor. Every mile bore the twisted bodies of those who had once dared to challenge the Republic. The crosses stood for months, a gruesome warning to any who would dream of defiance. The message was clear. Rome could forgive rebellion from kings or generals, but never from slaves. Crassus claimed the glory of victory, but history would grant him little of it. As his legions mopped up the last resistance, Pompey arrived from Hispania, capturing and slaughtering fleeing remnants of Spartacus' army in the north. In a letter to the Senate, Pompey claimed, "Crassus has conquered the slaves in battle, but I have extirpated the war." The rivalry between the two men deepened, shaping the political tensions that would eventually destroy the Republic itself. Spartacus' name, however, refused to die. Though the Romans left no monument, his legend spread across generations. To some he was a bandit, to others a hero, a man who dared to rise against impossible odds. Even the Roman historians, bound by loyalty to their republic, could not help but admire his courage, discipline, and leadership. In the centuries that followed, his story became a symbol, invoked by revolutionaries, freedom fighters, and philosophers. The German insurgents of the 16th century, the revolutionaries of France, and the reformers of the modern age would all find inspiration in his defiance. From the dust of Italy's battlefields, the Thracian slave who once fought for survival became a legend of liberation. His name was whispered where men were chained, sung in rebellion, and remembered in history not as a conqueror, but as a man who dared to be free. As night fell upon the Appian Way, thousands of crosses stood against the Roman sky. Among them, unseen but eternal, was the spirit of Spartacus, unbroken, unburied, and unforgettable.